People think wealth is usually destroyed in one dramatic moment. They imagine a market crash, a bank failure, a layoff, a recession headline, a panic on television, and they say that is where the damage happens. Sometimes the final blow does happen in public, but most of the time the real damage is done quietly, months and years before the public ever notices. It happens in the small choices that feel normal. It happens in the habits people defend because everybody around them is doing the same thing. It happens in the money that disappears without ever looking dangerous. And by the time the big event arrives, by the time the debt cycle breaks, by the time the economy forces honesty on people, the outcome is already decided. I have spent my life watching the arithmetic of capital do exactly what it always does. It rewards discipline long before discipline becomes fashionable. It punishes waste long before waste becomes obvious. It transfers wealth from people who want to look secure to people who are actually becoming secure. That is why, when I hear people talk about the next 18 months as if the danger begins in the future, I think they are already late. The danger for most families is not only what the economy might do next, the danger is what they are buying right now. The trouble with debt cycles is that they make foolish behavior feel safe for a very long time. Credit is available, monthly payments are manageable. Asset prices seem resilient. Consumption is normalized. Every bad decision can be dressed up as a reward, a necessity, or a harmless convenience. Then the cycle turns. What looked affordable becomes heavy. What looked liquid becomes trapped. What looked like an asset behaves like an anchor. What looked like a harmless leak is exposed as years of self-inflicted damage. And suddenly the people who thought they were one promotion away from comfort discover they are one shock away from insolvency. Ray Dalio learned a brutal version of that lesson in public. In the early 1980s, he made a major forecast, went on television, told clients what he believed, and he was wrong. He was not slightly wrong. He was disastrously wrong. The economy did not collapse the way he expected. It moved the other way. His reputation was hit. His business was broken. Clients left, and he had to borrow money from his father just to cover bills while supporting a wife and 2 young children. Most people never recover from humiliation like that. They either become timid or they become louder. He did something smarter. He stopped worshiping certainty. He stopped pretending that conviction alone could substitute for understanding. He began to study patterns. That change matters to me because it is the same lesson markets teach over and over again. Prediction makes people feel intelligent. Pattern recognition keeps them alive. A man who studies cycles learns not to ask only, "What do I think will happen next?" he asks. What has happened to societies, balance sheets, consumers, asset prices, and behavior? When debt reaches these kinds of levels, when interest expense swallows this much income, and when a culture has grown used to spending as if the bill will never come due? That is a far more useful question. And today the numbers are not abstract. Total debt in the United States is roughly $90 trillion. Federal debt is enormous on its own, and government interest expense has climbed above $1 trillion annually. For the first time in history, interest costs are consuming more than national defense. You do not need a genius to understand that. A system carrying that sort of burden has less room for error than people think. A debt cycle can endure longer than common sense expects. That is true. But every debt cycle ends with some version of the same truth. The obligations become too large. The flexibility disappears. Something has to give. Across history the forms vary, but the family resemblance is obvious. You get defaults, you get restructuring, you get inflation. Sometimes you get more than one at the same time. What you do not get is a painless escape engineered for the comfort of households that never prepared. That is the fantasy people cling to because the alternative requires discipline. I have always believed the most important financial trait is not brilliance. It is the willingness to endure being a little uncomfortable today so you are not forced into catastrophe tomorrow. The market pays a premium for that. Life does too. When people hear words like deleveraging, debt cycle, inflation risk, or wealth transfer, they often assume this is a conversation for macroeconomists, billionaires, central bankers, and hedge funds. It is not. It reaches all the way into the driveway, the dining table, the closet, and the bank statement. It reaches into the things people buy to soothe themselves. It reaches into the things they finance to impress each other. It reaches into every automatic deduction they are too distracted to question. In late stages of a debt cycle, wealth is not only lost by those who speculate recklessly, it is lost by ordinary people who never build any margin of safety because their daily habits consume the very capital that would have protected them. That is the part almost nobody wants to hear. People want a villain outside themselves. They want a politician, a bank, an oil shock, a war, a recession, a corporation, a technology change. All of those things matter. But when I look at households that are vulnerable, I usually find the same deeper problem. Their lives are organized around outflow, not compounding. They may earn respectable money, they may work hard, they may even think of themselves as responsible. But the structure of their spending keeps stripping future options away from them. So when the environment turns hostile, they do not merely suffer the shock, they suffer it without reserves, without flexibility, and without the ability to act when prices finally become attractive. That is what separates casualties from buyers. The quiet wealth transfer begins there. It begins before the crisis is visible. It begins in the gap between what people consume and what they retain. I have never been impressed by the household that looks rich from the street. I am impressed by the one that has room to maneuver. Because when the cycle turns, room to maneuver is worth more than appearances. A family that owns its choices can survive bad timing. A family that has pledged tomorrow's income to support today's image cannot take the automobile. For example, most people talk about a car as though it were a transportation decision. In many households, it is really a capital destruction decision disguised as transportation. A brand new vehicle leaves the lot and instantly begins a race downhill in value. That is not controversial. It is arithmetic. Yet people regularly borrow money at meaningful interest rates to buy something declining in value at a much faster rate. They finance depreciation. They finance ego. They finance the feeling of newness. And then they call themselves prudent because the monthly payment fits inside a budget spreadsheet. That is not prudence. That is a willingness to lock yourself into underwater debt for the privilege of owning an object that gets older every day and sends cash in only one direction. When the economy is forgiving, people barely notice. They are too busy enjoying the smell of the interior and the illusion of advancement. When the economy tightens, the truth arrives all at once. They need liquidity, but the asset is worth less than the debt against it. They need breathing room, but the payment remains fixed. They need optionality, but they purchased inflexibility. I am not opposed to transportation. I am opposed to confusing consumption with investment. There is nothing wrong with owning a reliable vehicle. There is something very wrong with trading decades of compounding for the temporary emotional boost of driving something new. If a household can purchase a quality used vehicle, let someone else absorb the steep early decline in value, avoid excessive financing, and redirect the savings into productive assets. That household has already moved itself into a different category. The neighbors may not clap. The dealership certainly will not, but the compounding machine will notice. That is what matters. A dollar not destroyed by depreciation remains available for ownership in businesses, and ownership in productive businesses is how ordinary money becomes extraordinary over time. The same misunderstanding shows up in housing, except there the cultural pressure is even stronger because society has spent generations flattering people with the line that their home is their greatest asset. Now let me say something carefully. A home can be meaningful. It can provide stability, memory, family continuity, and emotional comfort. But none of that changes the basic cash flow truth. If an item takes money out of your pocket every month, it is not behaving like a productive asset. Mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, utilities, repairs, remodeling, furnishing a larger footprint than you truly need. All of it draws from the household engine that may be worth it for the life you want to build. But it should never be romanticized as though every larger house is a clever financial move. Over-leveraged housing has ruined more balance sheets than most people care to remember. People like to tell themselves real estate always goes up because they remember select periods and forget the long stretches where debt, valuation, and reality finally collide. Look at Japan after its great bubble. Look at the United States after the housing mania. Look at what happens whenever a population convinces itself that land values are destiny and leverage is wisdom. A house purchased at the edge of affordability is not security. It is pressure with landscaping. The bank may approve a certain number, but I have never believed the bank's willingness to lend is evidence that the borrower should accept the offer. The bank is not asking what will maximize your freedom. It is asking what can be supported so long as conditions stay favorable enough. That is a very different standard. A household that buys the maximum the lender will bless is building its life on the assumption that income remains stable, rates remain manageable, repairs remain limited, employment remains secure, and broader asset markets never force hard choices at the wrong time. That is too many assumptions for my taste. I would rather own less house and more flexibility. I would rather have a smaller kitchen and a larger investment account. I would rather forego unnecessary square footage and keep the ability to buy assets when others are forced sellers. That is not glamorous, but glamour has never been a reliable path to wealth. People forget opportunity cost because it does not send a monthly bill. It is silent. You do not open the mailbox and find an envelope labeled, "Here is the fortune you might have built if you had not stretched for that extra bedroom, that decorative upgrade, that larger payment, that lifelong interest expense." But the bill exists. It is paid in foregone ownership of businesses, in delayed financial independence, in reduced mobility when life changes, and in the inability to act when the world offers bargains. I have lived in the same house for decades because houses are for living, not for proving something. The important thing was never the social signal. It was always what capital could do if left alone. Once you understand that, the desire to maximize housing consumption begins to look less like ambition and more like surrender to cultural pressure. And cultural pressure is expensive. Then there is the category people dismiss because each act looks too small to matter. Convenience food, restaurants, delivery apps, coffee runs, impulse lunches, takeout after a tiring day. A treat here, a quick order there, a few recurring patterns that feel harmless because no single receipt looks life-changing. Yet one of the greatest sources of financial weakness is the habit of making daily spending decisions without ever translating them into long-term capital terms. People say they cannot invest. Then they spend on food convenience with astonishing consistency. They do not see a portfolio leaking away because the spending is fragmented into dozens of forgettable moments. That is exactly why it is so dangerous. A leak you can rationalize is often more destructive than a mistake you would instantly recognize. When I evaluate a household's future, I care less about whether they occasionally spend on enjoyment and more about whether they have trained themselves to spend automatically whenever effort planning. Or patience would have solved the problem more cheaply, because that habit does not stay confined to food. It spreads. The person who cannot prepare lunch also struggles to prepare financially. The person who routinely purchases relief from minor inconvenience often purchases all kinds of relief. And usually at the expense of tomorrow. That does not mean living joylessly. It means understanding that repeated convenience spending is often a disguised tax on compounding. Cooking at home is not merely about saving a few dollars on ingredients. It is a declaration of control, planning meals, packing lunch, brewing coffee in your own kitchen. These are not signs of deprivation. They are signs that you are directing cash toward your priorities, instead of donating it to industries built on your impatience. The amounts can be shocking when extended over decades. A few $1,000s a year redirected into productive assets becomes life-altering capital. That is the part people resist, because once they see the arithmetic clearly, they can no longer claim ignorance. Then we arrive at one of the most corrosive habits of all, and that is status consumption. The world is full of businesses whose prosperity depends on your insecurity. They need you to believe your current phone is outdated, your clothes are inadequate, your watch is unremarkable, your furniture is uninspiring, your lifestyle is behind, your image is slipping, and your self-respect requires constant retail maintenance. It is a brilliant business model. It turns comparison into revenue. It monetizes envy. It transforms identity into an endless subscription to dissatisfaction. And it keeps millions of people trapped in a cycle where money that could have become ownership becomes presentation instead. I have never believed that looking rich is a substitute for becoming rich. In fact, the two goals often conflict. The easiest way to delay wealth is to spend heavily on symbols associated with wealth. The irony is almost perfect. People sacrifice real strength to imitate its appearance. They buy clothes, gadgets, upgrades, accessories, and fashionable proof that they are doing well, while quietly weakening the balance sheet that would have made them truly resilient. Nobody wins that game except the seller. If your confidence requires constant public confirmation, your finances will pay the price. And if your finances pay the price long enough, your future will eventually collect the debt. The mature investor learns to detach identity from consumption. Quality matters, certainly durability matters, usefulness matters, but novelty is not the same as value. Trend is not the same as quality. And social approval is one of the most expensive commodities in the world because it never remains purchased for long. The crowd always moves on. The wardrobe must be refreshed again, the device must be upgraded again, the lifestyle standard must be defended again. A person caught in that cycle is not building a life, he is maintaining a costume. And costumes compound for nobody. The same psychology shows up in smaller, quieter form in the invisible fees people ignore. Unused subscriptions, automatic renewals. Software that sounded useful once. Streaming services no one watches. Gym memberships no one uses, meal kits. Half abandoned. Premium ad. ON's convenience features, recurring monthly charges that remain alive because canceling them requires 10 minutes of effort people keep postponing. This category is especially dangerous because it flatters modern laziness. A business does not need to persuade you every month if it can persuade you once, and then rely on your inattention. That is elegant capitalism, and it is devastating personal finance. $100 here, $50 there, another $75 on something barely used. Perhaps $265 a month in total, maybe more. And the money slips out so quietly that many households could not list the charges without reviewing statements. But the market notices every dollar you fail to invest. Compounding is impartial. It does not care whether the missed contribution came from a grand mistake or 1,000 forgettable conveniences. The lost result is still lost. This is why I have always admired simple review habits. Once a quarter, sit down, examine every recurring charge, and ask whether you would voluntarily sign up for each one again today. Not yesterday, not when you were optimistic and distracted, today. With honest eyes, if the answer is no, end it. That one question is more powerful than most people realize because it interrupts autopilot. And autopilot is where weak finances go to hide by now. You may notice that none of these behaviors are really about cars, houses, food, clothing, gadgets, or subscriptions alone. They are about a worldview. They are about whether your money serves your future or your impulses. They are about whether you organize life around compounding or around emotional relief. They are about whether you see cash as seed capital or as fuel for presentation. Late in a debt cycle, that distinction becomes mercilessly important. During the forgiving years, all sorts of weak behavior can survive. Asset prices rise. Lenders remain generous. Consumers stay employed. Mistakes are masked by liquidity and momentum. But once the environment tightens, everything that was sloppy becomes costly. The family with low fixed obligations can adapt. The family with reserves can wait. The family with cash can buy. The family without those things must sell, borrow at bad terms, or watch opportunities pass from the sidelines. That is how wealth transfers. Not because one group is morally superior, because one group arrives at the crisis with usable capital, and the other arrives with obligations. History is loud about this. Even if people prefer not to listen, the Dutch learned versions of it, the British learned versions of it, Latin America learned versions of it, Japan learned versions of it. The United States learned it again in 2008. Different eras, different institutions, different slogans, same underlying truth. When debt becomes unsustainable, leverage stops feeling intelligent. Comfort habits become liabilities. Cash flow discipline becomes valuable. Ownership becomes precious. During the inflationary strains of the 1970s, plenty of investors discovered that nominal returns can flatter while real purchasing power quietly erodes. If you lived well below your means, maintained discipline, and accumulated assets when others were exhausted, time eventually rewarded you. If you lived right up against your income and confused motion with progress, the decade felt like treading water with weights attached. In 2008, the story repeated in another form. People who were over-leveraged, over-housed, undercapitalized, and psychologically unprepared were not just hurt by the downturn, they were trapped by it. They had to liquidate at the wrong time. They had to accept terms they hated. They had no ability to behave opportunistically because survival consumed all available attention. Meanwhile, households and investors with dry powder, patience, and emotional stability bought assets at remarkable prices. That is not cruelty. That is how cycles function. Assets move from weak hands to strong hands. Homes move from stretched owners to prepared buyers. Equity moves from panicked sellers to patient holders. And every cycle creates a new class of people who say the same thing afterward. They say, I knew things were expensive. I knew debt was high. I knew habits needed to change. I just did not act in time. Those words do not compound either. I am often asked whether wealth building is mostly about income. Income matters. Of course it does. But history is full of people with excellent incomes and terrible financial behavior. They make large sums and keep little. Their lifestyle expands instantly to absorb every raise. They convince themselves they deserve every upgrade because they worked hard. By middle age, they are earning enough to appear prosperous and saving too little to be secure. On the other hand, I have seen people on modest incomes behave with such discipline that over time they create genuine strength. They avoid foolish debt. They live below social pressure. They buy durability instead of novelty. They reduce leakage. They invest steadily. They allow time to perform the miracle people keep searching for in prediction. The miracle is not finding the next hot idea. It is giving capital enough years to work. That sounds too simple for a culture addicted to stimulation, so people keep hunting for complexity, but the structure of wealth has always been fairly plain. Spend less than you can. Avoid obligations that own your future. Direct surplus into productive assets. Stay rational when others are emotional. Repeat for a long time. That is not an exciting slogan, but excitement is overrated in finance. What matters now is that we may be far closer to the unforgiving phase of the cycle than many families appreciate. When debt service burdens rise, when governments are carrying immense obligations, when interest costs swell, when inflation remains a live possibility, and when financial assets have enjoyed long stretches of optimism, the margin for household error narrows. That does not mean everyone should hide under a table and await disaster. It means now is exactly the wrong moment to finance vanity. Maximize fixed expenses, outsource every inconvenience, compete for status, or ignore the small monthly leaks draining future capital. The time to prepare is before the system demands preparation. Once the deleveraging is obvious to everyone, prices have already moved, credit conditions have already changed, fear has already spread, and decisions are no longer being made from a position of calm. That is why late action is so painful. You are trying to become disciplined precisely when the environment is least forgiving of confusion. I would much rather become slightly unpopular with my own impulses now than become desperate later. The people who emerge from hard cycles stronger are rarely the people with the most impressive outward lifestyle beforehand. They are the ones who quietly built slack into their lives. Slack in cash flow, slack in expectations, slack in ego, slack in debt, slack in consumption. Slack is underrated because it looks inefficient in good times. But in bad times, slack becomes freedom. Freedom to say no to bad financing, freedom to wait instead of panic. Freedom to buy when others can only watch. Freedom to keep your dignity because your bills are not dictating your values. When I think about the coming years, I do not think first about catastrophe. I think about sorting cycles, sort behavior. They separate those who built financial habits on appearance from those who built them on arithmetic. They separate those who relied on ever rising conditions from those who prepared for conditions to change. They separate those who trained themselves to think like owners from those who trained themselves to think like consumers. If you want to be on the right side of that sorting process, the solution is not mysterious. Stop making permanent financial sacrifices for temporary emotional rewards. Stop telling yourself that daily leaks are too small to matter. Stop borrowing to buy symbols. Stop stretching for houses that turn your life into a payment schedule. Stop turning convenience into a philosophy. Stop allowing technology and advertising to write your budget for you. And most of all, stop thinking a better future will be built automatically by a person who refuses to govern the present. There is a great deal of drama in markets, in politics, in headlines, and every argument about whether the next crisis will come through inflation or recession or financial accident or some combination of them all. But underneath the noise, the ordinary laws still rule. Capital retained has power. Capital wasted has consequences. Cash flow matters. Debt matters. Opportunity cost matters. Time matters. Character matters. You do not need to predict the exact date of the next break in the cycle to benefit from those truths. You only need to act before the pressure becomes obvious to everyone else. That is the beauty of disciplined finance. It does not depend on perfect forecasting. It depends on behavior. If you stop destroying capital in small, respectable ways, you give yourself a chance to own more of the future. If you continue trading the future for convenience, status, and habit, the next hard phase of the cycle will simply expose what was already true. The wealth transfer people talk about is not magic. It is arithmetic meeting behavior. It is the market asking who has capital, who has patience, and who has room to move. It is the difference between the person who spent 10 years buying liabilities and the person who spent 10 years building optionality. The saddest thing in finance is not being poor today. The saddest thing is to have had enough income to change your trajectory and to discover too late that you converted most of it into things that never had a chance to make you free. Freedom is what this is about, not headlines, not fear, not showing off freedom. Freedom to choose work instead of beg for it. Freedom to hold assets instead of sell them in panic. Freedom to see a crisis as a field of opportunity rather than a sentence handed down by the economy. That freedom is usually purchased long before the crisis arrives. It is purchased every time you reject unnecessary depreciation. It is purchased every time you refuse to let a bank define your housing ambition. It is purchased every time you prepare your own food instead of financing convenience with your future. It is purchased every time you ignore fashion's deadline and keep using what already serves you. It is purchased every time you cancel a recurring charge and redirect the money toward ownership. These are not glamorous acts. They will not make you look special this week, but they are how people become uncommonly strong over time. If we are indeed late in a debt cycle, then discipline is no longer a nice virtue to admire in theory. It is a strategic requirement. The person who behaves as if current conditions will last forever is making the oldest mistake in finance. No condition lasts forever. Booms do not. Cheap money does not. High confidence does not. Easy refinancing does not. And the social permission to be careless does not. Eventually the bill comes. When it does, some people will call the outcome unfair. Some of it will be unfair. Life often is, but much of what looks sudden was quietly built through years of repeated choices. That is why I would rather speak plainly than comfortably. A car can steal future wealth if you buy it foolishly. A house can imprison future cash flow if you size it carelessly. Food convenience can quietly eat retirement capital if you indulge it without thought. Status spending can keep you permanently dependent on strangers. Approval, subscriptions can train you to leak money in your sleep. Any one of these habits may look survivable in isolation. Together they form a system of self-sabotage. Together they create a household that never accumulates the reserves needed to turn adversity into opportunity. And that, more than any forecast, is what should concern people in the years ahead. I do not know the exact day the pressure will become undeniable. Nobody does. But I do know how financial lives are strengthened before stress arrives. They are strengthened by stripping away what is unnecessary, by honoring opportunity cost, by valuing liquidity, by keeping ego cheap, by letting productive assets do the heavy lifting, and by remembering that the future belongs disproportionately to people who keep something in reserve when everyone else is busy spending to feel alive. The window to act is always open until it suddenly is not. That is the nature of every cycle. Preparation feels optional, right up until the day it becomes priceless. So if I were sitting across from someone who wanted the most honest advice I could give, I would not begin with a stock tip. I would begin with a mirror. I would ask where the money is really going. I would ask which purchases are protecting dignity and which are only protecting image. I would ask how much of the monthly outflow is building future ownership and how much is simply maintaining a lifestyle that looks normal in a culture addicted to consumption. And I would ask whether the person wants to appear comfortable now or become secure later. That choice, repeated enough times, explains a great deal of what happens in every debt cycle. The people who answer it well do not become wealthy because they guessed every macro turn. They become wealthy because they stopped feeding the habits that keep households fragile. That is still available to anyone willing to be honest. Not easy, not fashionable, not instantly rewarding, but available. And that is more than enough, because a family that stops wasting capital starts building margin and learns to think like an owner can do something extraordinary over the next decade. It can cross the line from vulnerability to resilience, from consumption to compounding, from fear to patience, from being acted upon by the cycle to being prepared for it. That is the real transfer worth fighting for. Not the transfer of headlines, the transfer of your own financial life from drift to intention. Once that begins, the economy may still be difficult, the cycle may still be harsh, and the world may still behave unpredictably. But you will no longer be living as easy prey for every downturn. You will be building the kind of position from which hard times, while unpleasant, do not have the power to destroy you. And in finance, as in life, that is often the difference between merely surviving history and finally benefiting from it.